Hi, and welcome to the OrgDev Podcast. So what are the biggest challenges organizations are facing in making hybrid working truly effective? And how can we design our workplaces, our teams, and our strategies with hybrid in mind? And what is the role of HR, OD, and managers to make it work? Now, it was thought hybrid work and the benefits it brings to a huge percentage of the workforce was here to stay. But the discussion about hybrid work isn't over yet. There's a lot of media discussion around hybrid working. Amazon, Boots, and JP Morgan are major employees ordering their people back to the office full time. And some business leaders, like the former boss of Asda and Marks and Spencer's, are saying that working from home is creating a generation of people who are not doing proper work. So today, we're joined by the brilliant Gary Cookson, author of the recent release, Making Hybrid Working Work, to tackle this critical area and help us understand the reality from the rhetoric. Gary brings a refreshing, evidence-based approach to hybrid working. And Gary is the founder and director of Epic, a consultancy where he helps clients to improve workplace and performance. He's got more than 20 years experience in both strategic and operational, HR, L&D, and organization development roles in the public, private, and voluntary sector. He's also a chartered fellow of the CIPD and of the Learning and Performance Institute, and a qualified coach as well. And he was recently featured on HR Magazine's Movers and Shakers list. As I said, he's a published author with 2 books, Making Hybrid Working Work, which was released this month, and also HR for Hybrid Working. And he somehow finds time to write and consult, even though he's a father of 4. And hopefully today he'll be sharing some of his secrets to how he does that as well. So welcome, Gary. It's great to have you on the OrgDev podcast.
Lovely to have you with us, Gary. So we've got lots of questions. There's no shortage of questions and things to talk about. So just to kick us off, tell us just a bit about the book. What inspired you to write it and what you hoping readers take away from it?
It was a long time coming. It was born from conversations I've had when my first book came out. The first book was all about the employee life cycle and how if you're in charge of an HR function, you have to change what you do when some of your employees work at home. And that was great. But the conversations that I had following that were all about with senior leaders. How do we make sure that the culture is right for hybrid working? What are the leadership behaviours that need to be different to make sure hybrid working work? What about changes to other parts of the organisational system and organisation design? And how do we make sure that it's right for our business as we sit within our industry and within our society as well? So much higher level questions than how do you do recruitment virtually and how do you do well-being virtually? So started then pulling together different bits of research, and that eventually resulted in Making Hybrid Working Work being the book that got published now. And it's been a really interesting journey to get to this point. Lots of polarized opinions, which I'm sure we're going to explore today around what remote and hybrid working is. Lots of evidence of organizations getting it right, but plenty more evidence of organizations getting it wrong as well. This is helpful to me as a researcher, as a writer, because it helps me to solidify the advice I give to people. But sad to see so many people get it wrong.
What surprised you most about the kind of research you did, and what surprised you when you were doing the research process?
I think it underlined for me that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to hybrid working. So in the book, for example, there's 40 to 45 case studies of different organizations and their hybrid working approach, and you'll struggle to find 2 that are identical. Really, really struggle. And sometimes it's a real problem for some organizations because they want to know what other people are doing, what other organizations are doing, so that they can copy and paste that into their own organization. And that's okay, but it won't necessarily work for a different context. So different ways of doing it, but also different ways of measuring it as well. That was a surprise to me. Loads of organizations try to measure the effectiveness of hybrid working, but just as many don't bother when they're okay with that. And even those that do measure it, there's a plethora of different metrics that they're tracking, from the obvious ones like productivity and performance and profit and so on, to things like their sustainability agenda and how far through that they are, their environmental footprint or turnover and retention for staff or well-being for staff. There's loads of measures, and it's about what matters more to an organisation. And that underlines how, again, it can be a very, very subjective, individualistic approach, and that comes through strongly in the book.
Cool. And you mentioned the case studies there, and there's loads of them in the book. How did you choose who you were going to bring into the book? Who got in the book?
I'd like to say there was a choice element to it, but I put lots of requests out for people who wanted to share their stories or their organizational stories. And everybody who responded, features in book, everybody. So there wasn't a case of me editing it out and thinking, no, that's not quite right. Because I recognise that if somebody gets in touch with me, puts a hand up and said, I've got a story to share, then I really ought to find a way of including it in the book. So there wasn't a choice angle. I was lucky that so many great stories came to me.
And you mentioned there that there's no one size fits all, but are there particular themes, the organisations that are getting it right and making hybrid work, are there particular themes that you picked up across the different case studies?
I think so, yes. I mean, the one big theme is they're not leaving it to chance. They're not leaving the way the organisation works to chance. And that's very, very right. And it's the way it should be. And it's no difference in remote and hybrid work than in-person work either. If you leave things to chance, they deteriorate, they go one way. But if you actually make some effort, if you think about the decisions you need to make and you plan them out and you consider the what-if scenarios, the consequences of everything, then it does tend to go quite well. So hybrid working is something that planners will like. If you're going to get it right, you've got to do an awful lot of forward thinking and forward planning. And that's the theme that emerges, that there are loads of different ways to do hybrid working, from very, very flexible approaches to very structured approaches, and both can work. But you've got to think it through. You may end up with a system where people come on site X number of days per week and the rest of the time they're somewhere else, probably at home. Well, that's your end point. And the big theme of all the organisations that get it right is that is where they've ended up. They've ended up with a model like that, but the way they got there, the journey, is the interesting bit rather than the eventual destination. And the organisations that get it wrong are making a statement to say, we've got hybrid working, our people can work X days at home, X days in the office. And that's where they've both started and finished. And that's the problem.
Yeah, I think it's really important. It's starting with the right question, isn't it? It's not the question isn't what's the right ratio of days in the office and days at home.
Correct.
The kind of what does our organisation need to achieve what it needs to achieve.
I'm thinking Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy now, and 42 being the answer to life, the universe and everything. And then, of course, the follow-up to that is, well, what was the question? Yeah. And I think that's where you're going to with this.
So sort of a collective experience that many organisations had was being collectively catapulted into working remotely completely after the pandemic. And a lot of organisations were kind of sort of making up as they went along. And now with hybrid working, the chance to reinvent, what influence has that had on how organisations are sort of their starting point with hybrid working?
Yeah, quite a lot. And there was a lot of organisations that maybe more through luck than judgment got things right during the pandemic when we had enforced remote working, but there was majority didn't necessarily land on a model that was particularly helpful. But let's be honest, there were other things they had to think about at that point. It wasn't high up on their agenda. So we're not blaming any organisation for what happened in the 18 months where we had enforced remote working. But from that point, as soon as restrictions were lifted and because they could then make choices about what they wanted to do, the kind of employer they wanted to be, the kind of employee experience they wanted to create, from that point, that was when it was really important to start thinking it through, and most, again, didn't. What happened in the pandemic with enforced remote working was not through remote working, though. Loads of advantages to it, and you'll remember some of those from first-hand experience, but loads of disadvantages brought with it at the same time because of the nature of it being enforced and mandated, and nobody had much choice, and it was all quite urgent at the time. So loads of mistakes made, and some organisations learned from those mistakes. They emerged from the worst of the pandemic and started thinking through what they needed to craft afterwards. They learned from that. Lots didn't. And unfortunately, some of the views you see about remote working now and hybrid working now are coloured because of the experience that was had during the pandemic, which wasn't, in my view, through remote working. And hybrid working is something different again. Full-time remote working is something that is not really very attractive to many people at all, but the same could be said of full-time on-site working. Hybrid working is where the great unwashed in the middle want to be. But there's so many variants in that. How do you find the right one? It's a real challenge for lots of organisations.
So it's a really high stakes decision, isn't it, for a business about when and where and how people are going to work. So what's your advice to organisations? Where do they start? Either if they're kind of thinking about this from a kind of a ground zero perspective, or they've got a kind of hybrid model that's not really working. Where do they start? How do they move forward?
Well, there's a range of questions that could be posed to an organisation then, and perhaps the most obvious starting point is, what kind of an organisation do you want it to be? What do you want to think about you as an organisation? What do you want your reputation, your brand, to be. Now, that's not just from an employee value proposition perspective, but it's all about what your customers might think of you, what your neighbours might think of you, what the wider communities in which you serve and in which you're located might think of you. Those are really important questions for any organisation to consider on an ongoing basis anyway when they're developing their strategy. From strategy then will flow things like values and statements about the culture, what it's like to be in that organisation, the way that information flows around it, where decisions are made, the way the organisation is structured and designed. Lots of things flow from that initial set of strategizing. And the values should flow through then into the approach itself to what work is. And lots of organisations don't really think that through. They might have really nice words in their values about being transparent and being flexible and people being empowered, and you know the kinds of words that you've seen before. But then if you say to people you've got to work here on Monday and there on Tuesday and between these hours, you're not really living up to your values. So you've got to make sure there's alignment between the practices and the initial questions about what kind of an organisation we want to be, what kind of an employer we want to be. How do we want our staff to feel on a Sunday evening, the day before they have to come back to work on a Monday morning? Those types of questions are really important questions for organisations to consider and will help them to think through the way they want to treat their staff, like how they want their staff to operate in the overall system they've got.
It's quite a rare thing, isn't it? Because organisations often become what they become for a whole variety of reasons. And something like hybrid working to many extent should be like a functional argument is often an ideological battle, or people's beliefs are ingrained in it. Like, what is an honest day's work and where do you do it as well? How do you do it? What approaches do you have for HR or OD if you are in an organisation where maybe you just have sort of some ingrained beliefs, particularly at senior level, where it is like, if I can't see you, you're not working?
Some of that is generational, I think. I mean, what can HR do? And strangely enough, I've been browsing on LinkedIn over the weekend, and there's loads of stuff about a recent episode of Panorama on there, and I've contributed to some discussions as well. But there's others where there's some really, really strong opinions and beliefs about remote working, hybrid working being bad. And what surprised me in reading some of those posts is how many HR people has that view as well. We tend to think of HR being progressive, forward-thinking, all about flexibility and empowerment, and actually that's not the case. Lots are, some aren't. So it could well be that as an HR professional or OD professional, you have a certain belief that remote working is bad and you find yourself in an organisation that agrees with you. So one thing that HR can do is nothing. There's nothing to do. So it's the case. Why rock the apple cart? Why break it? Why fix it if it ain't broke? The other thing you can do if you find yourself opposed to the organisation is leave and work somewhere more aligned to your values. That's an option for anybody, of course, regardless of profession. But in terms of what you do about the differences in beliefs, I think it's easier to change that one conversation at a time. That's my view about how change happens, one conversation at a time. And it's the same with changing cultures and changing beliefs and changing the norm in organisations. You rightly pointed out that some people's beliefs are based on their experiences when they were in the formative years of their career. But we have to look back and think about what kind of world of work that was. Now, I'm older than both of you, I think, but I can remember smoking at your desk in the workplace and having an ashtray built into your desk. And I can say that to my kids nowadays, and they can't conceive of such a thing. And they're entering a world of work that's very different than the world of work that I entered, and probably the one that you two entered as well. I mean, that's the same in lots of things. Technology is one, for example. I remember emails first coming in to organisations. Prior to that, I remember writing internal memos in records and sending them in the internal post. Just because that was the experience I had when I entered the workplace doesn't mean that that's the experience that other people have had since, or the experience I need to force upon other people. The same is true of remote working. There was no remote working when I started working. I'd been working 4 or 5 years before anybody even thought about it. So I got into a managerial position without ever being near remote working. Remote working came later. Just because that's the experience I had doesn't mean that's the experience everybody had, nor is it the experience I want to foist on other people against their will. The world has moved on. And in other ways, the world and society has moved on. Now, there's lots of families grew up, and myself included, grew up in a family where the man was the main earner and the woman, if she worked at all, had a part-time job focused on the childcare and the school runs and lots of other things. That's a very outdated model now. So my dad was able to go on-site working 5 days a week, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, because he had the mum in the background and his own mum, my nana, to do lots of the unpaid stuff that simply isn't right anymore in this kind of society. And haven't spoken to my dad about his views on remote working and suspect he wouldn't really think it's working. But he just try and foist his views on other people. He doesn't try and build an organisation where everybody has the same experience as him. He is at least intelligent enough to realise that the world is different. He may feel out of place in it, but he doesn't try to fight against it. He doesn't try to go back to how it was. Too many leaders in organisations, that's the way they want to play things. This is how I grew up. This is how my early years in my career worked out. Therefore, that's the only way it could ever work out for anybody else. And I think holding the mirror up as an HR professional to people like that and pointing out some of the things that I've just said, and people listening and watching to this will have their own similar examples, is a really good way to go. Now then, the person who you're telling that to, they may be so entrenched in their views that they're not willing to listen to that. Well, that's where the voting with your feet option is a realistic one to pursue, perhaps, but you can but try.
For me, the other thing is how do organisations strike that right balance between business needs and employee preferences? So I think sometimes like the waters there can get quite muddy. What advice have you got for organisations trying to walk that path?
I've had conversations on this the last few days as well. I've been looking at some HR professionals again on LinkedIn commenting that business needs have to come first. And if the business wants people back in the office 5 days a week, then so be it. And that's okay. I think it's a fine line, really. There's lots of available data, more and more every week, that points out that when you let people work more flexibly, hybrid's an example of that, but there are others. But when you do that, sometimes it doesn't have a positive effect, but what it certainly doesn't have is a negative effect on anybody's productivity and performance. It does have a good impact on turnover and retention, on absenteeism, on well-being, on lots of other employee metrics. And I would use data like that to show that we can balance these things. It isn't one or the other, employee or the organisation getting their own way. Both can get their own way at the same time. And hybrid gives us a way of looking at that in a way that previously we wouldn't have been able to. So the conversations I'd be having as an HR professional is to say, well, it's not either or. And how do we get business needs and employee needs in the same place at the same time? It's not one or the other.
I think that's something that HR sometimes gets wrong because it's so abundantly clear that things like hybrid work has such a positive impact on all the metrics, and it opens up access to talent pools that are going to help fuel growth in that as well. But sometimes I think we forget to make the case that others don't get the people as much as HR do, because HR lives and breathes it every day. Is that something that you experience?
Yeah, it is. And again, if you just look at the balance of the contributions to posts in the last week or so on LinkedIn and the Panorama debate, that most of the let's do hybrid working comments are coming from people who are in people profession, HR, L&D, OD. And most of the ones that are against hybrid working are mostly operational staff or senior leaders or people in particular niche roles where hybrid working's not been as available to them as it might have worked in some other roles, and might have harbored some jealousy or resentment about that. So yes, there is an imbalance in that. Now, it's easy to get across because one of the things that is a big enabler of most organizational success is great leadership, and a great leader has to understand their people. A great leader has to work with their people rather than tell their people what work they need to do. And if we're doing any work with a group of leaders in organizations, we can easily get across the point that hybrid working and other allied practices are great for staff. Therefore, as a leader, you are doing great things by enabling some of those things. And again, one conversation at a time, you should be able to spread that virally through an organization.
Just talking about the leaders and kind of manager aspect, do you think managing a hybrid team requires different skills?
Yeah. Oh, very much so. Yeah, very much so. Because when you are face-to-face as a manager, it's a very sensory experience. You can see what your people are doing. You can hear what they're doing. You get too close to them, you can smell them as well. But lots of that is not there when you're managing a hybrid team, or not there all the time. So I liken it to sensory deprivation or sensory loss. You know, if one of us lost our sight, lost our hearing, there'd be a period of adjustment, quite serious adjustment, and we'd feel quite lost during that time until we learn other ways to see what's going on, to hear what's going on, and don't use our eyes and our ears. And that's what remote and hybrid working is. It requires leaders to unlearn stuff and stop only using their senses to make decisions and start using data, evidence, digital forms of communication and other things like that will help them to be a much more rounded leader. There's other skills as well. We use the word or phrase soft skills. Now, I think that's quite a derisory term for something that is of critical importance to a leader. But I think as a manager of a hybrid team, your soft skills become even more important than they were face-to-face because of the need to combat isolation and loneliness in remote workers, the need to enhance collaboration and communication between the team, to make sure that recognition and feedback and praise is not something that's funneled through the leader, but something that's spread across the team. And managers who've been used to being the hub around which on-site working revolves, they're not the hub anymore in remote and hybrid working. They are part of a module, a network of connected people. And they'll be connected to lots of people and other people connected to others too. And we have to make sure that people work well with people. And that requires a leader to know what that means and to be able to coach that into people as well. And again, in a face-to-face environment, that might not have been quite so critical, but it definitely is face-to-face. The other one would be evidence-based decision-making, something that I've talked about a lot, and I'm sure you have as well, to not just rely on gut feel or gut instinct, to not just rely on one's own beliefs, but to use data to help you, and a range of other evidence as well, because it's all out there for hybrid workers who generate way more data points than a face-to-face worker ever could. There's so much you can see and find out about how the organization is working, how the team is working, how individuals are feeling. And hybrid working gives you that, gives you so much data. But as a leader, you've got to know, firstly, where to find it, secondly, what to do with it.
Those kind of things, you're in the domain of identity and how I bring value to the workplace is starting to shift, isn't it? These are huge things already. I guess in many respects, managers are often quite overwhelmed already, aren't they? One of the things that organizations get wrong, even with organization design, is that they're not clear with managers of what the expectations of them are now in this kind of hybrid way of working or with this new particular structure. Where does that responsibility sit for making hybrid work? Does it sit purely at HR's door, or does it sit much more than that?
No, I think if we let it sit at HR's door, then we're making a mistake, really. We're not engaging all the different stakeholders in this. This is something that the top team have to take responsibility for. The implementation of it may well sit with the HR team, but the design of it needs to sit with the top team with the right input from HR and OD professionals. It's a really important thing to get right because it affects so many parts of the organizational system. It's too important to be left to HR professionals, but I would make the same case of any other type of professionals. It's too important to leave to one team.
Yeah, so one of the other things I wanted to ask you about was around proximity bias that we know comes into play. How does that play out? How do we ensure fairness and transparency when we've got kind of hybrid teams, people in the office, people not in the office, people we see all the time, people we don't? What advice have you got for people around this sharing?
Because people get lost, don't they, in the system? Their work doesn't get seen or noticed, does it?
It's a real danger. And there was one word missing from your last statement, Gary, because you said people get lost. The word I would add there is can. People can get lost in the system. And that's about intentionality. If you leave it to chance, if you don't do anything about it, people can lost. People won't lost if the manager knows what to do and designs the work of the team and designs the interrelationship between the team in the right way so that doesn't happen. And the point you're making, for example, is a valid one, because For example, we're all co-located in the same office, and I'm your manager. One of you does a great piece of work. I can see it, hear it. I can smile at you. I can nod. I can say something. Because the prompt for me to do that is very close to me, in real close proximity to me. But when you're remote, how do I know that you've done a good piece of work? How do I know that there's something worth noticing and commenting on? So going back to Danny's points about proximity bias, that's where it can come into play, because you rely as a manager sometimes on the visual cues, the audible cues as well, to tell you when to do the things that as a manager you should do without anybody prompting you to do. Praise people, recognize people, acknowledge people. When they're remote, there might need to be a bit more of an explicit prompt for that to happen. And people might need to work out loud in ways that are not just verbal, are digital as well, that then showcases what they're doing day in, day out to whoever needs to see that. It's also unfair for that to be funneled through the manager. They become a bottleneck for that type of stuff. So the manager's got to work to develop that culture of recognition and appreciation across the team, so that those things can happen without the manager necessarily being involved or possibly being aware of things. Proximity bias, how can you measure it? Well, one thing you can easily do is track the interactions you have, not necessarily what the interactions are, but who they are with and how many there are. And the easiest way of doing that is to keep a 5-bar gauge or a tally chart. And you've seen the things, 4 vertical lines and a diagonal line across them. Every time you speak to somebody, put a mark against their name. It doesn't matter who it was, doesn't matter what the interaction was, but just note. And over a day, over a week, really interesting pattern can emerge visually. You can then see who as a manager or who as any individual really you are communicating the most with. And then you can start asking questions. Are the people I'm communicating with the most co-located with me? Are they remote? Did it change based on where I was? Did it change based on where they were? Did it change based on what we were doing? Time. Which communication platform did I use? Or was it entirely verbal? So every time you interact with a human being, you mark it down. And a really interesting visual platform to play there. Then you can coach, as an HR and OD professional, you can coach the leaders to make sense of that data and to do something about it, so they can start implementing asynchronous working techniques, and they can start looking at fairness and equity amongst the team and change the way the team works, so that proximity bias becomes less and less of an issue. So, but the starting point is to figure out, is it an issue in the first place? And that's where your data comes in.
Extending the subject of fairness there. So some organizations might have a blend of different roles where some naturally lend themselves to hybrid working and some just cannot be hybrid working. You know, they have to be on site to perform the role. Is it one in, all in, or can you have a blend? And how do you create fairness if you do? Because to many extents, you know, what comes with hybrid working sometimes is quite a privilege as well.
Yes, and that word's been levelled at me today in a conversation that we are creating a 2-tier workforce potentially, with some of the benefits of hybrid working available to some and not to others. And I say that's rubbish. I always say, and this will be a controversial statement that people watching this will have a view on, there is no such thing as a job that can't be hybrid. Now, I will unpack that for you. But I think,
do.
Yeah, I will. But also fairness is something that I don't think we should worry ourselves too much about. Fairness is about treating everybody the same, equally. Well, you know, on some jobs, you're on your feet all day. So does that mean we need to take chairs away from those that aren't on their feet, just so that we can level the playing field? For some jobs, we pay national minimum wage. I mean, we have to pay everybody national minimum wage just so we can level the playing field. I could go on with those types of examples, but there is no such thing as a job that can't be hybrid, and that's very, very true. What we've got, though, is a lot of tasks that can't be hybrid, a lot of tasks. And where we have problems is that somebody put all those tasks into one job. And that then means that job can't be hybrid. But that's a conscious job design sequence. Somebody made that job, and it might have been decades ago before hybrid working was even thought of, but somebody wrote a job description with a dozen or more things on that have to be done on site. And just when somebody wrote that, somebody else can rewrite it so that it can be different. And just because a job's always been done in one way doesn't mean it has to be done that way now. And just because that task's always been in that job doesn't mean that it can't go in that job, or that that task over there can't go in that job. And the way I recommend that people view it is to start working out task by task whether it's fixed or flexible in terms of both location and time. And you can use a job description as your way of looking at it. There's lots of other things you can use too. But you build up a picture of right now in this job, how much of what I do is fixed in terms of time and location. Those things, as things stand, cannot be done in a hybrid way. That doesn't mean with increased use of artificial intelligence or outsourcing stuff or just stopping to do stuff. But that'll always be the case. And then once you've got it for one job, you can easily do that for the whole team. Once you see the whole team, it's more a case of throwing everything up in the air, and then, much like the video game Tetris, as the blocks are coming down and trying to fit them into the right bits, that's what you're doing with the tasks to get them into the right jobs. And don't make the mistake that somebody 40, 50 years did of putting all the tasks that can't be hybrid in one job. Don't make that mistake. Why would you do that? You open yourself up to loads of criticism. So we can rebuild the jigsaw, but we can build it in a different shape and make sure that there is some element of tasks that can be hybrid in everybody's job. Real good example of this, my local GP surgery. Now, I don't know whether this is the case on all GP surgeries. I only go to the one. But you cannot get a face-to-face appointment at my GP surgery. You cannot. What you do is you fill in a form on their website when you want some treatment. You put in all the details. Now, previously you would have rung up that, but you fill in an online form. Within half an hour, somebody somewhere, GP, has triaged this and told you what needs to happen. Now, that GP is remote working. And all day, that GP, he or she, all they'll do is triage these online forms. They are not then involved in the follow-up. The follow-up might be go to the pharmacy. The follow-up might be come and have this done on site. It could be a phone, it could be a range of things. But that GP, for one of the 5 days they work, is doing that task. And they're doing it from wherever they want. They could come on site. They do choose to do it remotely. For the other 4 days, they're doing a traditional surgery where somebody else has done the remote stuff and then is referring them to come on site. All of a sudden, what you've got is a role that used to be 100% on site and there was no way around that. So using the technology in a way that enables tasks to be shifted, tasks to be unfrozen. And this GP surgery, though, people like my dad moan that it's all done online, but it worked really well. From the GP's perspective, they get 20% of their time working from home. So it can be done. And I've got loads more examples in the book of jobs like pizza delivery, of jobs like fashion retail shops, and of jobs like receptionists in office blocks, all being done remotely.
Can we have the pizza one?
Yeah, you should have the pizza one. Well, this is a nearby pizza chain, well-known pizza chain to me. There aren't many, so if you're thinking of a pizza chain, it's one of 2 or 3, and you'd be right. And in this shop, the branch of this well-known pizza chain, they've got 5 people. They've got the people who do the cooking and stuff, but they've got 5 people. And one of these people is what you might call the logistics person. They take the phone calls, they take the orders from the online app, and they tell the cooks what to cook and the delivery drivers where to go. And the other 4 people, they are the delivery drivers. Delivering pizza at the moment, at least until drones take over, is an on-site location. It can only be done in person. There is no argument about that. But then the logistics person works entirely from home. And what this pizza shop did, with a bit of help from me, it'd say to them, instead of being a team of 4 and a team of 1, you're now a team of 5. And you all work 5 days a week. But instead of the logistics person doing logistics 5 days and the 4 drivers doing driving for 5 days, we're going to mix up the tasks so that you'll all have 20% of your time doing logistics and 80% of your time with the driving. So now what happens is when it's your day of the week to do the logistics, you can do that where you want. There's a space in the shop where they can do it, or they can do it remotely. It's all done through a phone, and they can choose where to do it. And then the other 4 days of the 5 that they work, they're driving. but it applies some task flexibility. It does require conscious effort. Somebody wrote a job description for pizza delivery people that said that's all you do. Somebody wrote a job for, I don't even know what the job title is, pizza logistician or whatever it might be, who said these are all tasks you do remotely. Because somebody did that once, we can do it again and say these tasks can be all thrown up in the air and put back in a different order. That's what we're talking about to make hybrid working work in eventually every job.
That's some really interesting examples, Gary. Thank you. Telling, makes you think, doesn't it? So one of the things that always comes up when we talk to organisations about hybrid is culture. At some point, company culture will come up in the discussion. When we did the pre-discussion to this with you, you said something really that I wrote down. Hybrid reveals culture. Can you just say more about that kind of culture piece around hybrid?
Now, the quote is not mine. I've developed it, but the quote came from, so I should give credit to Chris Hurd. And I've paraphrased slightly because it suits the analogy that I'm extending here, but he said something about distributed work. It doesn't kill culture, it reveals it. So I talk about hybrid work and I take a little bit further. What I mean by that is that hybrid shows you where the problems are. And, there's a couple of analogies I can give you here. I've recently discovered that I've got high blood pressure. Now, I'm trying to work out why. But the reason why I know I've got high blood pressure is we bought a blood pressure monitor and I started testing myself. Now, that shows me the problem. It doesn't tell me why the problem's there. It doesn't tell me what I can do about it, but it shows me that there is one. And I've got two choices about this situation that I'm in now. I could either try and tackle the cause of my high blood pressure, or I could throw the blood pressure monitor away and say that it's because I tested myself that I now know about an issue. Well, that's the same about hybrid. And I think the example I gave you in the pre-discussion we had, if I remember rightly, was about the garden that you might plant. And I think if you look out of your window now, Garen's got his curtains closed so we can't see his now. But if we did, we'd see a garden. Now, if you're lucky enough to have a lawn with some grass and so on, you look out now and, it's winter now as we're recording, so it's not necessarily growing fast, but it won't be long, and it will. And Gary could stay looking out of his window all week long looking at that grass and might not notice any changes. Now and again, if he comes back every other day, he'll see some changes because he's not there all the time. See it. And over time, that garden, unless Gary goes out and does something, is going to get overgrown. It's going to deteriorate. And that's the same with culture. Now, the vehicle, the lens through which Gary is seeing his garden is his window. That's hybrid work. Hybrid work is the lens through which you can see more clearly what's going on in different parts of your organization. And you've got a couple of choices at that point. You could get out there into the garden and start doing some weeding, which is what I'd recommend. Or you could do what Garen's done, close the curtains so that you can't see what's going on here. You can pretend that these problems don't exist because you can't see them. And if you are working entirely on site, you will not see what's going on in other parts of the organization because you can only see what's within your eye line. You won't see the other bits. Hybrid working shows you more of what's going on. It's not the cause of any cultural deterioration, but it enables you to see it more clearly. And you can either get out there and sort your culture out, or you can say everybody back to the office because I don't like what I see.
When you're talking, like, for example, with the pizza thing, like, as human beings, we love patterns, even if not the right optimal patterns for us as well. So, there is something around the comfort of knowing that you're the logistics person and you're introducing things like challenging convention and status quo, and people might attach status to things like being the logistics person. That's the kind of thing where you're starting to make difference there, isn't it? So sometimes that's the more challenging elements where the case is absolutely clear why it should change, but yet we still struggle as individuals to change.
Yeah, we often do. And that's human nature. Probably there's another podcast in that, I think, about the way
and a book.
Beings respond. Don't start me on that, Gary. My wife will be very, very angry. But yes, I think so. And human beings, we don't like change, but hybrid working is all about change. And it's change mostly for the better as well. And it will create some resentment in some job roles where they think, I can't do this, where they see other people doing it. It will. It will create some resentment from leaders who 30, 40 years ago didn't have the ability or the privilege to be able to do that. And they now resent other people. So I can understand why it creates a lot of resentment, but we can do something about that.
So you also work, on top of being an author, you're a consultant, you're out in the field, you're leading on change, and you've also led it within organizations as well. What challenges do you typically encounter when you're trying to support an organization to do more of hybrid working?
Probably the most obvious one is when organizations are adopting a structured, fixed hybrid approach, something like 2 days here, 3 days there, for everybody. The challenge is making that work for everybody, because no two jobs are the same, and no two people doing the same job doing it in the same way. And having a structured fixed hybrid approach sounds great, sounds reasonable, makes you sound like a really good employer committed to flexible working. But actually, there's more to it than that, as we've explored a little bit on this podcast. So the big challenge is, once you've made that decision as an organisation, how do you then support the managers and the teams to make that work? And that's where I often come in to do some of my work there. Left to their own devices, they can often, through trial and error, sometimes get to the right point, but therein develops inconsistencies, and therein develops little bits of cultural deterioration. So there are challenges then to make sure there's a cohesive approach, more than just 2 days here, 3 days there. You can't stop there. But many organizations, sadly, that's what they do. So that's the big challenge I try and tackle.
And then are there any particular kind of trends or topics that are kind of emerging in the field that are kind of really interesting you at the moment?
Yes. So we're recording at the end of January now, and we're a week away from an episode of Panorama, which highlighted a lot of trends around organizations mandating people to return to the office. And you don't have to go far in the media to see more and more examples of that. And it's quite a sad state of affairs. I mean, we may talk specifically about Panorama, but there's a trend that many organizations are abandoning hybrid working. Now, my view on that is, what's their data? And can they show in years' time, 2 years' time, that the decision to abandon hybrid working made a difference? I suspect they're not interested in the data, so they won't have any. It's all to do with opinions and so on. And that's the trend at the moment. There is a trend of organizations going the other way and making it work as well. But the ones that get the media coverage are the ones who say, I'm already back to the office, because that's where the magic happens. And it's hard sometimes to try to disprove some of that, but it's also hard to prove that that's the case as well. And sometimes whoever is saying such things, they don't want to hear the opposite view. They've already decided. They don't want to see the evidence that things are working, but they're not interested in that. They own the organization or they run the organization. That's good enough for them. So that's a big challenge, a big trend that I'm seeing at the moment, is organizations realizing that hybrid work for them isn't working, rather than trying to fix that or holding their hands up and say, hey, we didn't even try. They're just going back into the office and hoping for the best. It's like not being able to swim and deciding to go down to your local pool and then being surprised that you drown. And that's the kind of analogy we've got with organizations who are saying this hybrid working, it's rubbish, isn't it? Let's go back into the office. It's not even trying.
And they won't see the consequences of that decision for a long time, because there'll be a lag, won't they, in terms of whether people's day...
They're not interested in measuring the consequences. They're not interested in consequences. Yes, you're right, there will be a lag. You're quite right. They're not even going to try and measure them.
So if you look back at your kind of work so far, what are some of the biggest lessons you've learned that you think might be valuable for our listeners to...
Well, hybrid's easy because I say the same things all the time to everybody. No one size fits all, don't leave it to chance, things like that. And so those are the big lessons on hybrid working. In terms of my own career, I think 2 lessons probably stand out to me. One is a phrase that didn't understand until maybe the last 10 years or so, that it's not what you know, it's who you know. And that's a phrase that, somebody said to me 40 odd years ago, that in life, it's not what you know, it's who you know. And I didn't really understand it or want to understand it. But in the last 10 years, it's really been hammered home to me that, yes, it's great to have a stock of knowledge and a great lot of skills, but relationships are where the difference is made. Building relationships for me, consultant with my clients, but also when I was in-house roles with fellow senior leaders and varied stakeholders, and working on the strength of the relationship has been more beneficial to me than adding qualification after qualification after qualification. And it took me too long, I think, Danny, to realise that. The other bit of advice that's worked for me is living your life in the right sense of priority. When it was introduced by you earlier on, you said father of four, correct? When I introduce myself on a conference stage, I say father of four, husband of one, and I get a little bit of spare time. And in that spare time, I run my own business. And I try to live my life in those proportions as well. So that gives an insight into what matters in my life. I say things in that order, and I live my life in that order. And it took me too long, again, to get to that point as well, and realizing where my focus needed to be as a human being, and made lots of mistakes along the way. But now, thankfully, I've got more control over what I do, and I'm happy with the blend that I've got. Now, I don't necessarily want everybody to go out and have 4 kids and so on. So that's not what I'm saying you have to do. Don't follow me down that route, at least not unless you want to end up looking like me. But it's about identifying what matters in life, and that'll be different for other people, and making sure that you put the right amount of effort into that.
And what do you do to keep learning and evolving in your field? Obviously, a book is a huge experience, and you're having to go out and find new references, find new theories and that as well. But what particular practices or habits do you found that are especially useful for you?
Well, in years gone by, I would have talked to you about social media here, I think, and in particular Twitter, which was dearly departed, and I lament its loss quite a lot. But Twitter was a godsend for me 10, 12 years ago. It was where I built my personal learning network. It was where I was exposed to some of the leading thinkers, not just in HR, but in life as well, and was able to connect with and converse with those people. So social media for me was the main way in which I was exposed to new ideas and got the kernels of research and then started to expand and to build upon. So that worked really well for me. I don't know, but obviously the book is a big way of doing it. And I've just started writing a third book, different topic. And that helps me because it send out requests for people to share stories, for people to share their insights and experiences, and people do. And it's great for what I end up publishing, what I write about, but it builds a relationship with that person that I can then tap into them for other things, and vice versa, and learn through them. And that's really helpful. So it's repeating a little bit of what I've learned from social media, but it's through a different channel now. And I'm also repeating some of the advice shared about life lessons. It's not what you know, it's who you know. And that's come into the fore now in my research, that it is about learning through other people for me nowadays, and far less than through books and videos and formal stuff. I learn through talking.
Well, Gary, I want to say a huge thank you. It's been a really great interview. It's been provocative. It's been thought-provoking. It's been practical, and really important. It's evidence-based as well, which is what this subject desperately needs. Obviously, along with everything we've discussed today, there'll be a link to your new book and your first book in the show notes as well. Thank you. For those that are in audio, Gary's just sharing a picture of the book there, but that's available on all the different normal platforms for books, isn't it? Is that right?
It is, yeah. Amazon's probably the main one, but the Kogan Page website would be another one, and all leading bookstores as well.
Brilliant. So many takeaways. Danny, what are you taking away from today's conversation?
A lot of the things. I think some of the things that stuck out for me, the importance of intentionality when you're kind of thinking about your hybrid model. I liked what you said about the importance of working out loud. I think that's a really important message for leaders to take away. And I love the idea of visualizing who we're interacting with and kind of keeping that log of how many times we're talking, interacting with different people, because that data would be really powerful. I think some of the organizations we're working with, just seeing that pattern in front of you will give you some really good insights.
Yeah, and reflecting all those points and build on some as well. So you talk about, is fairness possible for all employees, and maybe sort of attacking that in a much more sophisticated way. The idea that helping leaders understand that hybrid working is a form of great leadership is by understanding what employees need as well. I think that's a really important bit. And also the importance of challenging convention around how we just sort of collect things into tasks, then into jobs. And it's the giving ourselves permission to challenge the status quo and to really change how we hardwire organizations, and that everything is on the table if we really want to make this work as well. Gary, it's been brilliant. It's been really good. We really strongly recommend your book. It's a really great book. it should be recommended reading for all HR people and managers thinking about attacking ways of working in a much more progressive and sophisticated way. So thank you so much, Gary. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. Really enjoyed myself.
Thanks, Gary.